Hello and welcome to a talk about glacier travel and route finding on glaciers. I'll be going through some different procedures, some different tips and tricks, and some verbal descriptions about different parts of glaciers during this talk. So to start with, I'll be talking a little bit about some different types of crevassing that happens on glaciers. So to start with, we have the transverse cracks, which go across the glacier, and when the glacier flows across rocks or drops or things of that nature. This forms crevasses that are typically perpendicular to the direction that most people want to travel, and it also creates features like ice falls and seracs and things like that on the glaciers. Another type of feature we'll talk about are marginal crevasses, where the ice on the side is meeting resistance with the rock, and as it moves, it pulls the glacier open on the sides of there, or on the margins of the glacier. Longitudinal cracks typically go parallel to the direction most people want to travel on glaciers, and this is where the glacier spreads out and splays a little bit, and those form those longitudinal cracks. And then bergschrunds are the features on the edges of glaciers where either snowfields or rock walls meet a moving river of ice that is the glacier. These tend to be a little bit bigger and potentially deeper than most of the other crevasses found on the glacier. This picture here shows an ice fall where the glacier is flowing over some rocks. It also has an area where the glacier kind of comes up over another rock and shows cracks kind of forming in all directions on the right side of this picture. So this would be more complex glacier terrain. If you look at the edges of this glacier, you can see the cracks that are along the side. Certainly there's cracks everywhere, but the ones along the side, as the glacier is pulling it open with the resistance against the rock wall at the side. This picture shows a dramatic bergschrund at the edge of the glacier between the static snowfields or the seasonal snowfields on this rock face and the moving glacier as it's moving down valley. These can be somewhat of the cruxes as far as getting on and off glaciers in certain places as far as traveling around in these areas. So these are some general ideas about when you're choosing a route or route finding on a glacier. So generally speaking, we want to try to avoid the side margins if possible. They tend to be more cracked up than the center of the glacier. Medial moraines, which are rock piles that are pulled into glaciers in the middle of the glaciers, either on or along them, can sometimes be really good route options that provide us with lower risk travel in this glacier terrain. Typically speaking, we want to avoid cutting corners. So as we travel up glaciers, our temptation is to cut the corner, but those corners many times have more crevassing than the center of the glacier again. When you are looking at maps, especially topo maps, USGS topo maps, when they show glaciers on maps, generally it's quite when they show crevasses on maps, generally it's quite crevassed. So it's nice to, if you can find some local knowledge, things like people who've been there in the summer, guidebooks sometimes have good information on the overall crevassing in certain areas. The other thing that's super helpful and more available are really awesome satellite images of these glaciers in the summer. And they allow us to have a map layer, and we can even plot our routes on a satellite image and then transfer them onto like a topographical map or onto our navigation device like our GPS or phone. So we can do a lot of this research about where some of these specific higher glaciated or higher crevassed areas are ahead of time so that we're prepared when we get out into the field into those areas. We definitely, when we're in the field and we're route finding like on the ground, we have to be really flexible and the glacier will dictate where we go many times. So we have to have our route be flexible to deal with the specific crevasse hazards and such in the field when we encounter them. Glaciers can be very different based on time of year, location, snowfall. If you travel up a glacier 3,000 feet, it might have a different hazard level than right down at the terminal moraine of the glacier, depending on what's happening with the snowpack and how the glacier is moving and such. So just keep that in mind when you're traveling, that there are going to be different amounts of hazard for those different situations. This is a satellite image of the Upper Jarvis Glacier, a glacier that I know UAF has some research projects on. And you can see that when you get a summer image like this, you can start to feel out where might be the best places to travel, where might not be the best places to travel and set up your camp. In the upper center part of this picture, you can see as the glacier goes around a corner there, that the margin, the upper margin of this glacier in this picture has a significant amount of crevassing. So out in the middle, there's much less of that. So that's just an example of how we use satellite images to. This is another example that's fairly similar. This is the Upper Kasner Glacier, sometimes called the White Princess Branch of the Kasner. And you can see as the red route comes up the glacier, you'd be tempted on, especially with this scale, to cut that corner as you made that turn. But you can see both on this topo map and in real life, there's a significant amount of cracking on the inside of that turn as it goes up around that corner. So this is a picture of one of the popular climbing areas on Denali. The left side of the photo is part of the West Buttress route, and you can see the northeast fork of the Kahiltna Glacier there. And it's even the topo map has a dramatic amount of crevasses shown on here. And so this would be an area that overall, unless there was some big need, that this would be a very high hazard area to travel for crevasse hazards. So when traveling on glaciers, you're going to sometimes run into ice falls and areas that are trickier to get through. And one trick is, at times it's possible to use the snowy margin on the side of a glacier to basically cross off the glacier onto the seasonal snowfield and traverse around a feature like this. It doesn't always work, and certainly there are other hazards, whether it's avalanche or rockfall or whatever on the edges of when you're off the glacier below slopes, but sometimes this provides you with a way to travel through a highly crevassed area like an ice fall. So these are some general tips for traveling on a glacier. The first tip is you pretty much always on a snow-covered glacier that's crevassed, you need to utilize a rope for safety in case anyone falls in. So you need to be roped together and provide each other that protection from a crevasse fall. And also it's very, very helpful if you go with your ascending self-rescue system like Prusix pre-rigged on the rope. After you fall in a crevasse, it's difficult and time-consuming to get that system set up while you're hanging on the end of the rope in a dark hole where you're cold and wet. So having it pre-rigged makes that a lot easier. Another thing is making sure everyone on your team has anchor materials. One of the things you'll need to do if someone falls in a crevasse is build an anchor that you can hook the rope to. For the time being, you will be the anchor. The individual who catches the fall will be the anchor, but hopefully you can transfer that weight onto an anchor you build in the snow and allow yourself some options for helping the person who's fallen in a crevasse get out. Traveling with more surface area is helpful. So if you have the option to, traveling on skis or at least snowshoes can help to bridge or help to reduce your force and reduce your chances of falling through a crack. You need to check things out as you go sometimes. If you're in a highly crevassed area and you're concerned, you can use like an avalanche probe. You could use a pole, maybe even pull your ski basket off your pole, or a mountain axe to do some probing and feeling around for crevasses so that you can have a feel for what's beneath you, what's beneath the snow. You want to be watching for things like linear depressions where the snow bridge that's formed over the winter has started to sag from gravity or from getting warm and starting to melt. And those can be clues that there's a snow bridge there or potentially a crevasse there. The other thing you want to consider is if you do fall into a crevasse, that you're semi-prepared for it, in the sense of you're not with short sleeves and no gloves, and because it's going to go from being 40, 50 above to being 20 degrees, you're going to be soaking wet from getting into the snow down there, and it's a pretty rapid change. And so getting things like your hands cold enough where you can't tie knots or use your Prusix or Ascend is a very real possibility. So you want to keep that in mind. Thin gloves, maybe light long sleeves. Have your puffy towards the top of your pack where you can swing your pack around and get your puffy on and before you lower it to the end of the rope when you're ready to start trying to ascend out of the crevasse. And so those would be some general tips for keeping yourself ready when you're traveling on a glacier. So some tips for crevassed areas. If you know there are crevasses around, one of the things that you're going to want to consider or do is to cross snow bridges, if you need to, at right angles, so that there's the least chance of someone having a pendulum type fall or having too much slack in the rope where they're going to drop a fair distance into the crevasse. If the rope's fairly tight and people are paying attention and you're crossing at right angles, hopefully if someone does punch through or fall through a crack, they don't go very far in. Another thing to consider is whether crossing a bridge makes sense. Many times crevasses don't go all the way across a glacier, and so it's possible to end run them. If you go and you explore a bridge and it looks unstable, it looks too narrow or whatever across the crevasse, you can work on trying to get around that crevasse and end run that crevasse. Another thing to consider is how you end run a crevasse is important. You want to try to avoid traveling parallel to the crevasse as much as possible. And if there's crevasses there that you know of and you're end running them, you want to also make sure to use a technique like shown in this picture where you maintain as much tension on the rope as possible, due to the fact that the potential for punching through in a scenario like this is reasonably high. So it's something you need to be aware of as far as working well with your fellow teammates on the rope. Another thing you may encounter are situations where you need to step across or jump across a crack based on a situation. And it's important to make sure that you really examine what you're looking at before you cross bridges or before you step across or jump across. The last thing you want is to step across onto a fragile snow bridge or a fragile snow overhang and punch through in a scenario like that. So use your probe, stick your head in there, get a side view on it, figure out what's really going on with the crack before you commit yourself to being on a bridge or to stepping across a crevasse. And if there's potential for someone to fall through more of a technical belay, whether that's like a seated hip belay or some other form of a little bit more security than just having someone self-arrest to hold a fall. One thing that we'll potentially encounter is glaciers that are half covered in snow and half not covered in snow. When you're totally below snow line or fern line on a glacier, you can sometimes dispense with a rope. Basically, you just need to not step into all the visible holes and features on the glacier, which is doable without a rope. If you've got the mixed conditions and you can find paths where you're on bare ice, you want to take those paths and avoid those snow patches because they could potentially be concealing crevassing, a moulin, something like that. And so we want to keep that in mind. And once we run into those conditions where even if we're going back and forth between bare ice and snow, we want to have the rope on and be prepared for that crevasse fall. That's a situation where you and your group should be roped up for travel. So as you're traveling, you're going to have to be flexible with your route, and a few tips for kind of making your way through it is if you see a crack ahead, one strategy is to cut the corner and try to do a diagonal to end run it instead of going right up to the crevasse and then taking a dramatic 90-degree turn to the side. Typically, it's more efficient if you kind of zigzag back and forth doing end running those, and trying, generally speaking, to avoid traveling parallel to the cracks. This can prevent more than one person from potentially falling into the same crack. So we want to keep that in mind when we can. Another thing that many times happens is as you're coming down a glacier, you've climbed up a hill or you've come over a crest, you get a view of that glacier. And so taking a picture of it, drawing a picture of it, getting kind of thinking about your navigation when you have a view of those crevasses, because when you're down at ground level on that fairly flat glacier, you might lose sight of you might lose the visual of the best path. So if you can sort of plan ahead and route find when you do have a visual, whether it's from above or even from satellite images and things like that. If you do traverse through a highly crevassed area, an ice fall, something like that, and you have to travel back through it, it's important to mark your path with either a track on a GPS device like a Gaia app on your phone or a Garmin GPS handheld, or to wand it, which are little 4-foot tomato stakes with a little reflective tape on them, and you can carry 50 to 100 of those and basically mark every 100 feet or 200 feet so that you can weave your way and find your path back through the glacier, even if the weather comes in or there's a whiteout or some such thing like that. Another thing to just keep in mind is that when you do want to define an area for camping in, for doing research, whatever that might look like, you need to probe that area for safety before you and your team remove your ropes. And then a lot of times it's nice to mark that safe area, and after it's been thoroughly probed, people know that that's an area they can remove the ropes. And then another thing to just keep in mind with route finding is if you have to cross off and on a glacier and cross a Bergsund, many times that can be kind of cruxy in the sense that you'll have to climb a steep snow slope or a steep ice slope to get across a Bergsund, or look hard for a specific place where you might cross effectively. This is an example of a diagram of a way that you could probe a safe area. With a 3-person rope team, the middle person is using their Prusix on their harness to basically belay the people who are doing the probing in a circular pattern, and then you're bisecting it while being belayed and basically checking the area to confirm that this area is crevasse free, and then gives you that peace of mind and safety for removing your ropes for that operating in that area. So I've got a map here of the lower ice fall on the Muldrow Glacier, and you can see on this map the ice fall is labeled, and you can see that there's a significant amount of crevassing. And what I wanted to show is that this is a picture of that same glacier, and you can see that those, we'll call it 6 little lines across showing crevasses on that topographical map, translates into a fairly significant hazard or a fairly significant obstacle for traveling through an area like this. So as you're planning your routes, utilizing the different tools you have to make sure that you recognize what those hazards might look like. So if people do fall into crevasses, there are some real world problems that need to be dealt with. The first problem I'm going to talk about is communication. Basically, as soon as someone plunges beneath the level of the glacier into a crevasse, there's pretty much no communication that's available between the people up above and the people in the hole until you basically stick your head over and can yell at them that way. So what this means is, one, you have to rig up a system so that you can get yourself safely out to that edge to communicate and see what that person might need or to help them get out of that crevasse. The second thing it shows is that you need to have formulated somewhat of a plan, somewhat of an expectation within the group you're traveling with about what's going to happen. Okay, if someone falls in, the person who falls in gets themselves warm clothes, knows it's going to be a little while, knows they should start to try to self-rescue with their Prusik ascending system. The people up above know that they should try to set an anchor and escape the system that they're hooked into once the anchor is solid, or whatever that looks like. But that communication ahead of time is an important aspect of a effective rescue, getting someone out of that crevasse. Another thing that's a real world concern is hypothermia. And I would say true, like 3-degree drop in body temperature takes quite a while, but to get cold enough to not be functional, to be shivering, to not being able to use your hands, things like that can happen much, much quicker. So we want to be aware of getting cold for the person who's fallen into that crevasse, and take the steps to put the necessary clothing on and take care of oneself if one does fall into a crevasse. Another one is potential injuries, whether that's hitting your head, whether that's twisting your knee, something like that. There's the potential falling like that you could get injured, and that would require extra help probably to get out of that crevasse. There are also all different kinds of crevasses too. So you could get wedged in where there's no chance of any sort of self-rescue because you're pinned in there and you can't function. And you could potentially be pinned in there upside down. You could be there could be water, and you could have fallen into water at the base of that crevasse. Another thing that regularly happens is the rope cuts pretty deeply into the lip, and so sometimes what people need realistically is a well-padded, well-prepped lip and a second rope thrown down to them, or a different part of the rope. And so keep that in mind, that sometimes it's virtually impossible to haul someone through the lip of a crevasse or to ascend or self-rescue yourself through that lip of that crevasse. And then another thing that's potentially could happen in that scenario is if you're hauling someone, you could pull them up into the lip of that crevasse. They can't go through it, but they're getting sort of crushed into it. And that could be a potentially difficult or dangerous situation for that person. So in many scenarios, all the person who's fallen into a crevasse needs is a helping hand to get out. They don't necessarily need to be completely hauled out. Sometimes it's helpful, and that's part of your help, but really it could be that they could easily climb out, if there's a low angle slope somewhere, and you could just keep the tension on the rope to protect them if they were climbing out. Sometimes just getting lowered 10 feet and then walking up a snow ramp to escape a crevasse. A padded lip, in other words, preparing the lip fully and dropping them at a drop C, which is just an anchored end of the rope and then another end that's hooked to them, that you could pull them up with a simple 2-to-1 system or help them with that. Someone who's in a crevasse might be able to use something like an ice screw and put it into the wall and put their foot into a loop connected to that. And there's very And sometimes all they might need is at the lip. They ascend right up to the top, and all they need is someone to give them a hand and just kind of help them pull over the top there. And so those are all potential methods of helping someone out of a crevasse, and dealing with some of the real world problems that happen if someone does fall into a crevasse on a glacier.